because we want to make this available to our other members. And I was just reminded by my dear friend Dawn to do that. So thank you, Dawn. All right, so welcome everybody. And before I get into the introductions of our speakers, we would like to start with a prayer. And since this week is our 50th anniversary of Vatican II, we thought we would start with an opening prayer that the Council used before each of their meetings. And we would invite you to go ahead and say this out loud with us from wherever you are. And I want to thank Rick for sharing this with us. So if we can start in prayer, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, conscious of our sinfulness, but aware that we gather in your name. Come to us, remain with us, and enlighten our hearts. Give us light and strength to know your will, to make it our own, and to live it in our lives. Guide us by your wisdom. Support us by your power, for you are God, sharing the glory of the Father and Son. You desire justice for all. Enable us to uphold the rights of others. Do not allow us to be misled by ignorance or corrupted by fear or favor. Unite us to yourself in the bond of love and keep us faithful to all that is true. As we gather in your name, may we temper justice with love so that all our decisions may be pleasing to you and earn the reward promised to good and faithful servants. You live and reign with the Father and Son, one God, forever and ever. Amen. So again, thank you all for being with us today. Let me do an introduction of our two speakers. First, I'd like to introduce you all to Rick Krivanka, who serves as a consultant to parishes, dioceses, religious communities, nonprofits, and healthcare organizations. He has served as Director of Pastoral Planning Office for the Diocese of Cleveland for over 32 years. Rick has worked with the Appreciative Inquiry for the past 20 years and has helped to introduce this approach within the Catholic Church on a national level. And in 1995, Rick received the Lumen Gentium Award from the Conference for Pastoral Planning and Council Development, a national recognition of outstanding leadership and contributions in support of pastoral planning and council development. So we are so thrilled to have Rick with us. Along with Rick is Tony Fleo, who is a frequent lecturer and consultant on development, leadership, and shaping culture within faith-based and mission-driven organizations, and is presented in regional, national, and international conferences. His experience is not only theoretical, but practical, having worked over 20 years implementing and nurturing organizations in their commitment to mission and community. And Tony serves as Development Director for St. Elizabeth Seton Parish in Plano, Texas. And both Rick and Tony are CSEC members, and we are so thrilled to have you both with us. So without further ado, I'm going to be turning it over to Rick and Tony to guide us through their presentation. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity. Appreciative Inquiry is a great love of my life, and I'm just so thankful for a time to be able to share with you some of the great things that I've discovered about its use in many different settings. I also would like to point out as we go forward with this, as we talk about appreciative inquiry and how it connects with strengths and strength-based development, not only in parishes, I would encourage you to think about this in the whole of your life. As we're talking about appreciative inquiry, what are some of the possibilities of how this relates to your family life, how it relates to life in other work settings or community settings, because I think it has tremendous application. And it's also like clay, that you can mold this around so many different things. I also like to point out that if someone were to ask me in those 32 years working in pastoral planning, what were one of two of your greatest discoveries, clearly appreciative inquiry would be one of those, because it has just meant so much in my life and in the lives of others that I serve. Tony, if you want to say a little bit more of the hello, and then I can go on.
Sure. Hello, everybody. This is Tony, and I just want to echo what Rick had to say about that in terms of how it is very transformative. It is learning about the process, and fortunately, I was the beneficiary early on of one of Rick's lectures, which was the first time I was introduced to it, and it was a major paradigm shift for me, not only in my own approach to ministry, but in organizing all of our pastoral planning from that point on. And I was very grateful to Rick for bringing this great information to me, so much so that I immediately, as soon as I could, brought Rick to the parish to do this work for us here at the local level.
Good. I wanted to go forward and make a connection between what I see as three pillars of a major new movement that is focused deeply on strengths and the power of seeing the good in people's lives. As Stephanie mentioned, I had begun working with Appreciative Inquiry over 20 years ago, and one of the blessings in my life, I happened to live and work about 10 minutes from Case Western Reserve, where David Cooprider has been a professor, and got to meet him when he started as a doctoral student back in 1980, and have cherished that relationship. But I've been able to follow the evolution of Appreciative Inquiry somewhat indirectly, and then very much in a direct way about 20 years ago. But one of the things that I began to see as I was working with Appreciative Inquiry in the 2000s, in the previous decade, I began to discover the work of Gallup on engagement and also Strengths Finders. And at the same time, I began to discover things about positive psychology and what does authentic happiness mean, and what is the place of positive emotion. And I was doing a good bit of personal pondering of those things and how interrelated they seem to be. And then I had a remarkably validating experience in 2007 at the Third International Conference on Appreciative Inquiry that brought about 800 people together from all over the world using it. There were three major keynotes, and the slide that you see represents those keynotes. David Cooprider spoke about Appreciative Inquiry and the power of the positive question and looking for the good in every life setting. The second keynoter was Marcus Buckingham. And some of you may know him from his work with Donald Clifton in some of the early development of Strengths Finders, and the two of them co-authored the book, Now Discover Your Strengths, in 2001. Marcus then went off on his own, but one of the things I was particularly aware of as I learned more about Strengths Finders was the Appreciative Inquiry question that so guided Don Clifton's life. And as some of you probably know, back in 1952, when he was a graduate student, he surfaced and deeply pondered the question, what would happen if we actually studied what is right with people? And that question shaped not only his graduate work, but the rest of his life work, and it certainly led to Strengths Finders and so many of the remarkable things that he developed. But that, in fact, is a powerful Appreciative Inquiry type of question. And I know one of the things that was driving Don was his lamenting that so much of what was in the field of psychology and other studies was so deficit-oriented. It was always about what was wrong with people. The third speaker at this conference also felt that. His name was Marty Seligman, and he is the founder of the field of positive psychology and has the first graduate program in that field at the University of Pennsylvania. But Marty also lamented that there are literally, he was first saying this in the late 1990s, thousands of studies and resources that only focused on weakness in people, what made people unhappy, what were, in a sense, psychological flaws. And he began to realize, why don't we study what makes people authentically happy and what really brings goodness into their lives? And so, again, he founded this field. And I point this out in part because, depending on how much you know about these different areas, when you put them together, they have a tremendous synergy that so reinforces one application relative to the others. So I would really encourage some further exploration of that. Stephanie, do I have the control of the slides? It seems like I don't. Hello?
Okay, I will go ahead. Yep, I'll go ahead and move them for you.
Okay. I'd like to go on and share a context for Appreciative Inquiry that I like to use because it situates everything under the category of leadership. And I realized that you are all here in this moment, and certainly in your parishes, as leaders. And so it's important to think about, how does appreciative inquiry connect to the role of leadership? And my first premise, this is a quote from Edgar Schein, who's a leader in the field of organizational development. And he says that the essential role of leadership is to create the culture of the community or organization. And then I added the words, in our conversations, because in essence what culture is about is the way we see and talk about ourselves and the world around us. And that's really formed by the conversations that we have. And I like to emphasize that culture exists in every setting. We oftentimes think of culture racially or ethnically, but every family has a culture, every parish has a culture, every group has a culture. And what comes forward is the question, what kind of culture? And I think that what should be a hallmark, certainly in our parishes, is that whatever we're talking about and doing creates a culture of life and hope. And I think a culture that truly reflects our living the words of Jesus, I came that they might have life and have it more abundantly. And I like to also present this in a sense as even a kind of an image of a pro-life culture. And going on to that next bullet, a culture in which we see and reverence the sacredness of life every day, in everyday life and ministry, that every conversation, every meeting is a sacred encounter where we experience people's gifts and strengths, their energy, initiative, creativity, hopes and dreams. It's all sacred, especially if we see it that way and can really bring that forward, because I know so often the images people have are not necessarily about that sense of meetings as sacred encounters. In fact, there's often a lot of cynical conversation about that. And I also think another hallmark of those encounters needs to be that, again, people not only find life, but they find hope. And I believe appreciative inquiry is a wonderful tool to bring this forward. I added that last point. I had a wonderful opportunity back in 2009 to go to the 4th International Conference. It was on appreciative inquiry, and it happened to be in Nepal. It was hosted in the city of Kathmandu. And I was going there to present a workshop on the connection between appreciative inquiry and spirituality. And so I knew I was going to be dealing with a very diverse population from a religious perspective, as well as culture and so forth. And in my preparation, I was developing a protocol I was going to be using at the workshop, and so I met with a diversity of people in Cleveland. And one of the persons I met with was a doctoral student in organizational behavior, and he happened to be Buddhist by background. And I remember when I asked him about his use of appreciative inquiry in his life, he says, it deeply connects with the Buddhist principle of mindfulness. And he says, I always ask the question after every conversation and encounter, how do I leave people in my wake? And the image there is, if you think of a boat in water, a boat of any size, from a toy boat to a giant freighter, always leaves a wake. And I think it's also true with ourselves. Every interaction, whether it's in a store, at a meeting, in somewhere on the parish grounds with our family, every interaction leaves a wake. And I think the question we can certainly ask ourselves is, how do I leave people in my wake, day in and day out? And my hope is, with a little more life and a little more hope. And again, appreciative inquiry, I think, is a way to help to foster that. I want to say a little bit more about leadership, some other images. I think leadership is essentially relational. You know, the mission of Jesus is essentially about relationship, our relationship to God and our relationship to one another. I think a second point is what's so important in those relationships is resonant relationship, the sense of being in tune and in touch with one another. And I think the best image of this is the image of the Good Shepherd, where Jesus says, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. And Jesus doesn't say, well, we always agree, we're always going in the same direction. I was so intrigued once. I was doing a workshop on appreciative inquiry with a group of priests in Connecticut, and it happened to, the upcoming gospel happened to be the gospel of the Good Shepherd. And I was just wondering, what are sheep really like? Because I don't really know anything about sheep, but they all look the same to me. And so you can Google anything, and I put in a Google about sheep temperament. and found a wonderful quote by a shepherd who raised Navajo Chiro sheep. And he says, "They are also varied and different. No two are the same." And he just spoke of their remarkable individuality as it is with people. And I think the image of resonance is, however diverse people might be, do we talk in ways that help us to be in touch with one another and to understand what's really important to one another. And then this, the third image of leadership here is that leadership is about moving and inspiring and mobilizing people to a more abundant life, to which Christ calls us, to a sense of common mission and shared future. And I think it's fair to say that people need far more inspiration than information. And it's so important that our conversations create that kind of inspiration in people's lives. And I think that's another facet of appreciative inquiry. This is another quote, and I want to say a little bit more now specifically about the power of conversation. And this is a quote by Margaret Wheatley, and I've used this so many times because it speaks so profoundly to what gives hope and light in people's lives. And as you can read it on your own, it speaks to how human conversation as the means to restore hope is as simple as I can get. That's how we do it. There's nothing more powerful to bring about positive change than to convene a conversation. Real change begins with the simple act of people talking about what they care about. And she goes on to say, that's what's possible, not what's wrong, and keep asking. And I've been deeply moved in my life in recent times realizing that in so many cases where there is life happening, it is because of the conversation. In a sense, our relationships are really barometers of the conversations we have. If we talk about a good relationship, it's often because we have life-giving conversations. And if we talk about a difficult relationship, it's often because our conversations are so difficult. And so I think there's a real call in this to be deeply aware of how does each of us generate conversation, and where do those conversations lead? Tony, you had a really good insight about some of societal trends and conversation. If you want to say maybe a little bit more about that and some of the other things we've put out here.
Sure. Rick, one of the things that you talked about early on is that the role of the leader is really to form and to shape culture. And when we talk about shaping culture, we're talking about lifting up the values that are the priority values for our particular belief system and our particular tribe, if you will. So for instance, in my family, you know, I certainly value my car, but I value my children a lot more than my car. So my children should get specific and intentional and deliberate attention, right? So what happens in our faith communities is that the really good leaders understand that their role is to come into the new community, whether it's the parish, whether it's the diocese, and it is to take the culture that already exists and enhance it, not to transform the culture to themselves. And one of the key things about understanding this from a leader's perspective is that in order to really understand culture, you have to understand what does that organization value. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there are values that are lifted up that are higher than the dominant culture values. So we're going to contrast the dominant culture, the world in which we live, what are the values there, and what are the values of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Our faith communities should always be lifting up those values of the Judeo-Christian tradition as opposed to the dominant culture one. And for instance, in the dominant culture, conversation is not the highest value, communication is. So everything is about how effectively we communicate. In other words, how effectively we talk at people. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the value is conversation over communication. The root word, of course, to conversation is conversion. We can't enter into a conversation without being changed at some deep level if it is a conversation worthy of our participation. So the role of the leader is to really lift up conversation as the value. But in order for it to be a value, the leaders have to be intentional and deliberate about it. This appreciative inquiry process gave me a way to form questions and shape questions that really was intentional and deliberate about moving the congregation forward as to what was possible. And what emerged from that was very transformative.
Great. Well said, Tony. Thank you. I just as a further footnote on this, I just would so emphasize we're going to be getting into some very practical tools about how do you create an appreciative question and conversation, but to, as we're into this part, to really go away with as a takeaway, just a great awareness of the power of your everyday conversations and the potential for life and hope that you can generate in all kinds of moments, as mundane or everyday as they might be. I want to share with you a reflection from Bishop John Hopkins from the East Ohio United Methodist Church. And I had met him. I had done an ecumenical workshop a number of years ago, and sometime later, on Appreciative Inquiry, he wrote an article, and these are some excerpts, and I think they kind of sum up the powerful connection of conversation and hope and relationship. And he goes on to say that hope is dependent on the quality of our conversations. Our conversations build our relationships, and our relationships build hope. And so he says the key to the future is, as I was just encouraging, tending to our conversations. And he says, hope springs from the appreciation of life and goodness that's always there. There is always good and God's grace going on. The challenge is, do we see it and talk about it? But then he says, discouragement comes from words we exchange even more than realities. And then he profoundly notes, when we have a right relationship, we sense that no matter what the future holds, we will be together. And so the power, even in times of great turmoil and difficulty, the power of conversation to restore hope is so always in our hands if we only can see that and grasp it. I want to share with you just a little story in Appreciative Inquiry from earlier this week. I was beginning a new process in one of our largest parishes, and we were pilot testing a set of questions that were, in this case, focused on some of the general questions I'll be showing you later, and specifically on an initiative in this parish to make Sunday Eucharist more important again in the lives of all of our people in that community. And so in testing the questions, we had a group of about 20 parish council members and parish staff members, and we tested the questions. And I always ask people, what's it like to use these questions? And this one man said, and it was just very profound to be in that moment, he just looked up and he said, this has been a very difficult year for me. I think some of you may know that, some of you may not. It's been very hard. But in this moment, in this conversation with these questions, I'm in a new way beginning to feel such a sense of hope in my life and in our lives. And I am just so grateful for that. So just in one passing question 3 days ago, there was such a remarkable expression of hope that was coming out of just one person's life. And I've heard so many stories like that in other settings. I want to share with you now the roots of appreciative inquiry, and I want to do that by showing you the difference between two methodologies. Many of us are one that we're familiar with and one that's appreciative inquiry. And the traditional way of trying to make things better in countless organizational settings, family settings, school classrooms is what you might call the, I don't know what's happening on my slide here. Let's see, something's missing. Well, the problem-solving method. And typically what's done is we look at what's wrong, what's the weakness, what's the deficit, who's causing it, which often leads to a lot of blaming, like who did this, who's at fault, and suddenly people start getting polarized. And then we come up with a prescription, and we implement it. And the premise is, if you think of the underlying metaphor, is that our situation is a problem. Our parish is full of problems. My children are a problem. My workmates are a problem, whatever. And it becomes a kind of deficit-oriented mindset. And the way appreciative inquiry actually began, David Cooperrider had arrived in 1980 in Cleveland as a doctoral student, and he was doing work, and he's told the story I'm going to tell you a number of times at these international conferences and locally, but he was doing work at the Cleveland Clinic with a group of doctors. And he went to this one group and he asked them, well, tell me about the problems, because that's what consultants often do. And they began to say, well, the nurses don't do this right, the administration doesn't support us, we don't get the research we need, the environmental services doesn't keep everything clean, and on and on. And he realized, as he was using those standard consulting questions, the more people talked, the more negative their images became, not only of the present, but also of the future. And the more de-energized they became. They were just getting more and more down. And what he decided to do, instead of saying, well, that's life, that's what we do, he went back to his professor, Sylvester Vasta, his advisor, and said, I want to approach this in a different way. There's got to be a better way. Because he was fascinated with the Cleveland Clinic when he would enter different departments. And as many of you may know, it's a world-famous center, especially in cardiology, but in all kinds of other areas of medical care. And so he decided to go back to another group of doctors in the department he was working with and change the question. And instead of asking what's wrong, he began to ask them, can you tell me a moment where you felt most proud of what was happening in your department, when really, really good things were happening? And suddenly they talked in a very different way. They became excited talking about the cooperation with the nurses, the remarkable healthcare teams they could put together on an interdisciplinary level, the remarkable research facilities, the way people came in from all over the world. And what was profound in that conversation is that the imagery they had was suddenly so positive and hope-filled, not only about the present, but what was still possible to do in the future. And also, in a very significant way, the energy level was being more and more, was going up. People had more and more excitement. They had more and more positive feeling about what they could do together. And that's kind of at the heart of appreciative inquiry, how to release that energy, that hopefulness, that emotion that generates the best in people. And he went on to develop a 4-part model, and we're going to be looking at this in a couple different times. This is the first one, where you begin with trying to identify what gives life and to discover what's the best of what happens. And there is best moment in every setting, even though a lot of it may not always be that way. And then he goes on to say, well, after we've reflected and talked about our best moments, what's the dream? If we could imagine the best possible life, not the bottom line, but the top line, the highest level of goodness and success we can do, what would that be like? And again, one of the things striking with this step is so often in everyday settings, people anesthetize themselves to their dreams. People will say, come on, we can't do the dream. Let's just get on with it. Let's just be practical. And there is tremendous imaginative capacity we all have that can be so underused, or that we all can share with others. And then in a very practical way, he says, well, now that we've discovered moments that really work, that really give life, now that we've thought about the deeper dream of what's possible, let's begin to design everyday realities to be done in newer, better ways that would really build on those best moments and help them to happen more often and in even better ways. And then the last D, the do, how do we empower an ongoing culture of appreciation, of seeing life, and of being innovative? And so that's, in a sense, that's the model of appreciative inquiry. This is a little bit of a further background about David. This was the dissertation that he published in 1986. You can see where appreciative inquiry is actually used for the first time in a formal way. And what he was looking for is understanding and enhancing organizational innovation. In other words, he was looking for the highest line of what was possible. And one of the things that's very compelling in this different way of looking at it, certainly compared to problem solving, there's a wonderful quote by Albert Einstein who says, we cannot solve the problems of our time by remaining in the same way of thinking that created them in the first place. That we need new ways to think to really get beyond where we might have been. You know, and so often we're just stuck in the same old ways. I recall a particular story, Patrick Brennan, priest in Chicago, has done a lot on evangelization, and he wrote a book a number of years ago called Parishes that Excel. He was friends with Tom Peters, who wrote the book In Search of Excellence, and got some of the ideas on that with Tom. And he talks about having brought in Steve Hybels, who's the pastor that founded Willow Creek, one of the largest Protestant churches in the country, just a huge facility, and they actually have other churches in different parts of the country and an association. And they've done some pretty remarkable things, and their primary mission is simply to bring people to be devoted followers of Jesus Christ. I mean, it's very clear. And Steve was asked by Patrick, they had a meeting with a group of priests, and he asked Steve, he says, could you give us any advice? Is there anything you could suggest to us? And one of the things that Steve had said to them was, well, since you asked me, he says, I think too many of your parishes are on autopilot, that you just keep doing it the same way and the same thing. And he says, you know, you have to constantly seek ways to make the message of Jesus Christ and the life of Christ more fully alive, day in and day out, and constantly looking at even new and better ways to help that to happen. And again, I think appreciative inquiry is something that invites us to even newer and more creative ways of thinking. Also, as you'll notice the comments on the bottom of that slide, I want you to understand that appreciative inquiry has been used all over the world, from some of the biggest corporations, the U.S. military. It's been used, I mentioned that last example, the U.S. Navy will do this process. They'll have summits where they do appreciative inquiry in 3 days, and they'll bring together 800 or 900 people at every level of the organization and go through those 4 Ds that I mentioned. There's a website, the Appreciative Inquiry Commons. You just put those words in, you'll find it, where you actually can see a videotape of some of those sessions. It's been used by Catholic Relief Services to develop a deeper connection with their work in cultures all over the world, in educational settings, in Catholic settings. So there's remarkable use, and I like to emphasize that because I sometimes have heard people say in workshops, how could anything so positive be practical? Kind of a little bit of a reflection on some of the cynicism in our times. But this has been wonderfully successful in countless settings. One of the founders of the field of organizational development, a man by the name of Richard Beckard, had said before he died in 1999 that appreciative inquiry is changing the field and even the very ways we think about change itself. This is going to be the rest of the format. We're going to talk about a brief definition, spirituality, some basic principles, and pastoral applications. This is, first of all, a look at the word appreciate. It simply means to value the best in people, what is truly good, what truly gives life. Inquire simply means the act of exploring or discovering, and in particular, asking questions to see new potentials and possibility. So appreciative inquiry, it's simply the process of asking questions about what gives life and excellence and success and goodness in people's lives. This is another reflection from a more recent book by Ron Fry and Frank Barrett. Ron is now the chairman of the Organizational Behavior Program at Case, and was one of my favorite professors back when I was doing my graduate work. And they wrote a book, you can see the title of it, A Positive Approach to Building Capacity. And these are their 6 points about framing appreciative inquiry. First of all, they say, and so many people who get into this realize the truth of this, it's a way of seeing and being. What's been so powerful for me, this isn't just a method you use in groups or certain situations, but it's a way of seeing and being present in everyday life. The appreciative eye can go with us everywhere, in every kind of setting. It's strength-based. It's deeply founded on the belief that everyone has strengths. Every organization has strengths, and we need to try to discover those and hold those up and make the best use of those. It's about an artful search. And there is a kind of artful, creative way of really looking in the way we ask questions, in the way we frame the question, to more deeply get at what's truly life-giving. It's collaborative in every respect. And the intent is that we want to get people working together at every level, for example, of a parish, at every level of a parish, people talking to one another, encountering one another, hearing one another's perspectives on what gives life. And in that same way, it's also inclusive. The ideal appreciative inquiry includes as many people as possible in the organization. There are some settings where whole companies have literally shut down and brought everyone together and gone through the process. And certainly in a parish, we need to do it over time so we can include as many people as possible. This is not a method where a few people sit down, have a conversation and then tell everyone the results. And then lastly, it's meant to be generative. And I want to expound a little bit on that word because I was with Ron Fry about a week ago at a workshop, and he was mentioning that one of the greatest discoveries about appreciative inquiry over time, he says over a number of years, people saw it primarily as positivity, that we simply want to be positive, which is very important. But he says the deeper meaning of appreciative inquiry is to be generative, that when we ask positive questions and when we create positive emotion that connects people and gets them wanting to work together, knowing that to the opposite of that, negative emotion, when we create those kind of moments, people avoid each other. They don't want to talk to each other. But when we can create positive spirit and positive energy, we can bring out the best of human capacity, the best of our God-given capacity. And that's the goal, to be truly generative in countless life settings where this might be used. Tony, let me stop. I realize I'm kind of going on. We had talked about maybe my doing that and you jumping in. I want to make sure if there's anything you want to add.
Well,
And
just a couple of points there on that. One of the things that I want to really hit hard is that these things have to be intentional and deliberate. You know, this just does not happen by accident. This is a very intentional and deliberate process, and it's an intentional and deliberate way of being. And in bringing that about, you know, we go on autopilot, or as you were saying, you know, most of our parishes, you know, aren't inventing anything new or seeking to do things in new ways. This is a process that keeps that alive and in front of you, that you have to be intentional and deliberate about forming and shaping the culture and leading in the direction, asking the question in a way that it leads your community in the direction of the positively shaped question. But you're doing great, and you're on a roll, so keep going.
Okay, thanks. One thing, you know, I want to build on what Tony just said. I believe there is great spiritual discipline to using appreciative inquiry, and I'm going to be saying that in some of these coming slides. But this truly is spiritual discipline, to see and to talk and to act in this manner. The next slide here talks about what was the great thought I had when I first encountered appreciative inquiry a number of years ago, and that is these words of Jesus: "I came that they might have life and have it more abundantly." And I believe that that's what appreciative inquiry is about, that we might come to see the life that God's creating, that we could hold it up, that we could talk about it, that we could understand it more deeply, and we could help to create it even more abundantly. And so this is the heart of the matter for me, that particular reflection. I want to share with you another reflection by Nelson Mandela from his inaugural speech, or this is attributed to him. And let me just go back here. He speaks that our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate, but in many ways, our deepest fear is that we're powerful beyond measure, that we have tremendous strength and capacity. And sometimes we'd rather say, no, I just would rather be kind of not so good so I can just kind of get on, without realizing the incredible strength and blessing and fabulousness that God has given us as children of God, created in the likeness of God. And that our playing small doesn't serve the world. You know, our not recognizing the power of our strengths doesn't serve the world. And he goes on to say, when we were born to make manifest the glory of God, to do wonderful, incredible things, to give glory to God, everyone is given that opportunity and gift. And so we need to let our light shine. And I think so often, you know, when we create conversations that do the opposite of this, where someone's doing something great, instead of celebrating that, we begin to diminish it, almost out of a kind of envy or competitiveness. And so instead of helping everyone's light shine, we can say and do things that diminish everyone's light. And so I think it's so important to realize this incredible light in each one of us. And I think appreciative inquiry is a way to help more of that to happen. This is a scripture quote that I actually discovered on a day I was doing appreciative inquiry in one of our rural parishes a long time ago, and it happened to be the Sunday reading. And I think this also so embodies appreciative inquiry. And you need to understand that when Paul is writing to the Philippians, the context for this letter is that Paul is in prison and the Philippians are in conflict. So this is a very difficult situation. Now what Paul could have said is pointed out all the faults, all the wrongdoings, who is to blame, and how to fix it. But notice these profoundly beautiful words Paul uses: whatever is true and honorable, just and pure, lovely and gracious, if there is any excellence, anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And I'm sure Paul meant, and talk about these things, and then the God of peace will be with you. And as another nutshell, I think appreciative inquiry is simply practice what we preach, live these words. And this kind of image can be taken in countless everyday settings. And I think that's very much the spirit of appreciative inquiry. This next reflection is what I think is a wonderful theological foundation for appreciative inquiry, and it's actually a part of a presentation that Father Michael Himes gave in Cleveland in 1999. He was talking about sacramental imagination, and he says, to see anything for what it is, I mean anything, is to first see the goodness, the love of God. And then he says the challenge is to see things as they are, as God sees them, and as God says about creation. It is good, it is very good. And then he goes on to say that which is always and everywhere God's grace must be noticed, accepted, and celebrated. And in a sense, this is sola theology of appreciative inquiry, because can we notice, accept, and celebrate, and talk about, and hold up these countless moments of God's grace and blessings at work in our lives, because that's very much what appreciative inquiry is about. I can remember doing a workshop at a priest convocation, and there was a priest there who did a lot of work in leadership on a national level, and he made the statement, he was just in awe with appreciative inquiry, and he was saying, it's such a wonderful way of connecting our theology with our pastoral practice, and I think that's very true. This is another perspective from spirituality, and I discovered this because when I went to Nepal, I was concerned about using some spiritual imagery that would relate to the population there is very much Hindu and Buddhist, and at the conference there were people from all kinds of religions from all over the world. And this is a wonderful reflection by the Dalai Lama, who says positive things do not come by nature. Positive things, we have to make an effort, and we must make the effort, and no one can do this for us. And I think this is a powerful reflection on what we talked about earlier about the spiritual discipline of appreciative inquiry. It does not always come easy, and it takes, I think, a real intentionality to bring this forward. This was one of the discoveries in that workshop in Nepal, and it was kind of a premise we went into. And when we had people go through some appreciative inquiry questions about their uses of appreciative inquiry, one of the things that was validated, and it came out in countless ways from people, again, from all kinds of different religious backgrounds, that when they use appreciative inquiry, when they ask these questions, that they genuinely encounter the deeper spiritual and sacred part of their own lives and the lives of people they're in conversation with. That this is a different level of conversation. It's not simply about facts and opinions, whatever, but it's about things that are much deeper and sacred in people's lives. And again, that's true for people in all kinds of spiritual backgrounds. This next part is a little reflection by Ronald Heifetz. He was the founder of the Leadership School at the Kennedy School of Government. And he makes a tremendous statement about where our hearts are in everyday conversation and moments. And he says, we diminish ourselves, we squeeze the juice out of our souls, we close our hearts when we fall into cynicism dressed up as realism. And if you think about everyday life, there aren't too many people who walk around and say they're cynics. But there's a lot of people who walk around and say, I'm a realist. And one of the things I've been struck by, you can be in a conversation and one person's all enthused about a new idea, and someone in the group says, oh, come on, that's never going to work. And what often happens? The group will defer to the cynic. And so I think there's also other aspects of this, arrogance and callousness. And in many ways, appreciative inquiry is a wonderful perspective and tool to help to take on the kind of growing cynicism and callousness in the world. We begin to help people to say there's far more powerful and positive conversations that we can have, and so much more life we can create. Heifetz goes on to say that in leading with an open heart, you get all these, okay. In leading with an open heart, we need the courage to keep our hearts open. And first of all, he says, we need to give witness to innocence. And he says, we even need to be naive. Now, many of you would say, well, I don't want to be naive because, that means I'm really not in touch. But he says, notice the roots of the word naive. It's the same root as the word genius, ingenuity, renaissance. Why were some people geniuses? Because they were open enough to pay attention to things that everyone else was ignoring. They could have a real childlike quality. And I always like to remind people at this point, that Jesus says so clearly, unless you have faith like a child, you will not see the kingdom. And in so many ways, unless we have that simple innocence, we won't see the wonders that are going on all the time around us. In a way, we need to be like children to really be able to see it. And then he says, Heifetz goes on to say, we need to have curiosity, and that's part of the inquiry, to genuinely want to know more what gives life to people and the questions we ask, to be really open to hearing, and then again to have compassion, to respect and appreciate whatever they might be going through. I want to go on into a final set of principles, and then we're going to get into applications. And one of the things I'm hoping as we go through this is I believe that the more deeply people understand principle and foundation, the more effectively they can do practice. Sometimes people say, well, just give me the tool, but I think if you understand the thinking and the wisdom underneath the tool, there's so much more that you're able to do with it. There are 6 basic principles we're going to go over, The first is the constructionist principle, and it simply says, our words create our worlds. And what this means is people have often thought that language is descriptive, that when you talk, you're really just describing something. But in fact, when we're in a conversation, we're creating images that create a way that we see the world, and also that we look to the world and to the future. The way we talk creates a sense of what we're expecting, what we're going to live into. And it's so important to be aware that our conversations are powerful. And I'm sure you can recall some conversations where people talk often in a very negative or cynical way. And what's that part of the world often like? Often very negative and cynical. Or you might be in other conversations where people talk in very hopeful and creative ways. What does that world turn out to be? Probably a lot more hopeful and creative. The second principle is a poetic principle, and it simply says our organizations are like poems or like scripture, open to infinite interpretation. We would never hear a scripture reading and then hear a homily and say, oh, Father, you know, we did that one last year. We've done it several times. Every moment we read scripture, there is new possibility to see. And so is it with people in our lives, with our parishes. They're open to infinite discovery and understanding. The third principle is the principle of simultaneity, and it simply says that change begins the moment you ask the first question. And I'm sure you can all recall a time you walk into a meeting, someone's all upset, they point something out, and the whole meeting goes on a roll in a kind of very frustrating and upset direction. Well, it's possible to realize when you begin any moment, you could ask, but what's the positive question that could create a great conversation with our kids at dinner, or at a parish meeting, or in a larger assembly? One of my favorite recent memories, I was speaking with a provincial of an international religious community that I had done appreciative inquiry work with a number of years ago, back in about 2005, and I was just asking him how things were going. We had gotten together, and he said, well, one of the things, he said, at first he was very reluctant. He was kind of a more critical, analytical person, and he really grew to love this. And he says, now, wherever we are in the world, he says, when we start a meeting or something of significance, we ask, what is the appreciative inquiry question and perspective as we begin? And I think that's just a powerful way of applying that principle of simultaneity. The next principle is the anticipatory principle, and it simply suggests that deep change is rooted in our images of the future. So we have to take great care to how we talk about the future. There's a wonderful quote by Ken and Callahan who says that there are some churches who believe that their best years are behind them. They'll never be as good as they once were. And so the words that they use, the way they talk, constantly reinforces that. And so they live into less and less of the future. But he says the churches that are truly dynamic talk as if some of their best years are yet to come. Not in the same way that they were best, but in new and creative ways that will best fit a new time. And so in many ways, the way we talk about our future is in fact creating images we will live into. And so there's profound implication of, so what do we say about the future? Another principle is the positive principle, and I spoke to this a little bit earlier. When you ask positive questions, you create positive images. You also create positive emotion. People begin to get enthused and excited and energized. And so the energy level goes up. And we all know you need energy to do anything, and you need more energy to do great things. And so as that energy is growing, as people's relationships are getting more positive, we have tremendous greater possibility for positive improvement and change. And there typically for a number of years have been only these 5 principles, but in some of the more recent writings there is now what's called the narrative principle. And it simply says, when we ask questions that invite stories, which is the heart of appreciative inquiry questions, we create lasting bonds between people. That when people talk about powerful stories, things that have moved their lives, they not only stir up within themselves things that maybe they hadn't been aware of, but they create powerful connections with one another. There's like a visceral connection that's far more significant than when we are just giving opinions or facts. I always like to think, too, when Jesus would present stories rather than bullets, he didn't say, these are my bullets about forgiveness. He would tell a story of the prodigal son, and that story would far more powerfully say something to us than any simple set of bullets on a point.
Rick,
Tony, let me just stop. Oh, please. Yeah, oh, good, please.
just want to chime in there. You know, one of the things that was so important for me when I first discovered and started to learn about strengths was that I had this understanding of these foundational principles that you just talked about. And I think for the folks that are really engaging in strengths and bringing the whole strengths movement into their parishes, I think that spending some time with these foundational principles will really help to enrich the experience that your participants will have, because it really did help shape my thinking and my understanding. And I feel very fortunate that I was introduced to the appreciative inquiry process before I encountered the strengths and growing the engaged church and all of that great stuff. It really kind of set me up to do that and to understand that in a deeper way. So I just want to really hit that particular slide and ask the participants to really engage and learn about those foundational principles that Rick just laid out.
Tony, that's a great connection. There's a really good article I read recently about leading minds, and it talks about the place of how our brain works as part of the neuroscience. And so often, the way we really get to change behavior is we create powerful sets of thoughts to kind of call that behavior forward. So I'm hoping you're seeing all of this stuff as a set of ideas that can all be mixed together in the world of strengths and engagement. I also have noticed that some people have asked about the slides. Stephanie, I'm happy to have these posted. And also, you're going to see an email for Tony and I at the end, as well as contact information there. So if someone wanted to send me an email, I'll send you the slides. If it's easier to get them posted on the CSEC website, that's fine as well. But I just wanted to address the question that was asked. You're welcome. There it is. Anyway, I want to share with you, this is one of my newer things. This came up in some work I was doing a couple of weeks ago. And I've been doing a lot of work on emotional intelligence in recent years, and it's just tremendous things are being discovered about the place of emotion in everyday life. And so many, historically, we so looked upon our rational part, that that's what's really important, and our intellect and emotion is almost a kind of just a challenge. But what's basically being discovered is that we have emotion in every moment. That's the way our brains work. It's not whether we show it, it's what's actually going on inside of us. And this is a picture that is inspired. I actually found this looking for an elephant with a rider on the website. But there's a book that Dan and Chip Heath wrote called Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard. And they describe this image just in words, and they basically say, their point is that if we want to think about our rational side as compared to our emotional side, our rational part would be like the rider of the elephant. And the rider will oftentimes be thinking out, where do I need to go? What's the important direction? What's going to support it? What are all the practical considerations? But if you look at this picture, you realize that rider isn't going anywhere without that elephant deciding it's going to go along. And it speaks to the power of emotion, and in a sense, not just the elephant in the room, but the elephant in us. And in so many ways, change only happens not simply because of a logical, rational strategy, but because of how we engage the emotion in people and the enthusiasm to make it move forward. And there's an article I came across when I was looking further into this topic. It's actually from a book by John Cotter and Dan Cohen that says that when people go about change, they oftentimes mainly focus on strategy, structure, organization, and they oftentimes miss what's most important, and that is if you want to change people's behavior, behavior happens most successfully in situations where changes actually work when you engage people's feelings. So the critical consideration with any effort you use in any setting is, how are people going to feel? How are we recognizing the place of feeling? How are we touching it and engaging it?
Rick, I just want to,
Tony, please, yeah.
On that point, you know, one of the constant struggles that we have in the development world and in the stewardship world in the church with our finance councils is finance councils are always talking about how they have to disclose, you know, what every penny is spent on, and the stewardship people and the development people are saying, no, you have to tell the story of what is so effective and what is so wonderful about what your community is doing. And the research, in fact, supports the stewardship folks on that one, because there is an emotional piece that really motivates us. It is what moves us forward to the giving and to being more and more generous. In fact, when we go through the specific intellectual details of, we're spending $300 on wine for Eucharist, somebody's automatically thinking about, that's too much money, we shouldn't be spending it. So there is a lot to that point that you have just made about engaging the emotions, using the emotions, and of course all the emotional intelligence stuff is really a key into our being effective in the parish level.
So great point. The other thing I would encourage all of you, whatever you do, don't ever say, I don't care what people feel about this, because so much of the power of engaging them is creating and doing things that can really engage their positive feeling and enthusiasm to want to do it. So it's a whole other way, and there's tremendous amount of research out there now that's saying even when people that may look to you as very stoic, very unemotional, when they are actually thinking, the emotional core of their brain is engaged when they actually make a decision. And that's true for all of us. I'm just saying, this is not about whether you show emotion, it's about how emotion actually works within people. And Daniel Goleman, one of the founders of that field, says it's the way we feel about our thoughts that leads us to make a decision one way or another. And that's again true for the most low affect person you may ever know. How they feel about their thoughts is really what's driving a decision one way or another. This is a connect I wanted to make to growing an engaged church and the work of Alan Weinsman that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, but certainly you're very aware of all the Gallup research in not only parishes but all kind of organizational settings that belonging leads to believing, and that what's key in that in engagement is that engagement very much involves how do people feel about the parish and the positive engagement, and not simply do they show up. And that emotional connection is key to building a deeply committed and engaged community. And I know Tony and I were talking, one of my favorite quotes from that book is the difference between being involved and engaged. There are some people who are involved all the time. They show up at everything, but then they're like cave dwellers, consistently against virtually everything. And well, by the way, and just while that's true, the other thing from an appreciative perspective I would encourage you to remember is one of the appreciative dimensions is how do we understand the strength and the contribution of people who may oftentimes seem cynical or like victims or whatever, because we can appreciate every kind of voice. We just need a little more discipline to do that in some cases. I want to go through the appreciative inquiry cycle again and then give you some practical examples, and then Tony's going to be sharing a story of doing this in a parish setting, and then we're going to invite any kind of topics or questions you might want us to say more about. But again, this all begins with the first D of discovery. And that is, for any given topic, I'm going to give you some general questions. You could ask questions about what most gives life when we do this, and I'm going to give you a practical example. So it begins with the power of the positive question. And again, it's simply what gives life, what brings out the best of life on that particular topic. And it could be about how we welcome people, our life in prayer. It could be about community outreach. It could be about joy in parish life. It could be about hospitality. There is no limit to what you can ask these questions about. And then the premise is, after you have some initial questioning around what gives life, we begin to evoke the question of the dream, and realizing that we have tremendous capacity to use our God-given imagination, even though we're maybe oftentimes not asked to do that. I remember it once being said, if you want people to be creative, just ask them to be creative. And sometimes people will say, well, we didn't know we were allowed to be creative, or we didn't know we were allowed to share our dream, and so let's release that. And then again, the third D is the one of co-constructing what should be, and this is where you almost become like social architects. If we take insights and practices that we've done really well when we do them, even though we don't do them all the time, and if we think of those most creative ideas, that deeper dream, how do we just begin to literally redesign everyday practices from what happens and how people might be welcomed into a parish, what happens when they walk in on Sunday morning, what happens when we meet as a group. We can just go on to countless everyday situations where we can redesign what we do based on the first two Ds. And then again in that fourth D, how do we sustain a culture which sustains appreciation? That sense of really being more open to seeing the good in one another, to empowering one another, to being creative. And again, always to be more faithful in giving glory to God. That's why we do it. I want to share with you now 5 basic questions, and this is a practical tool. You can just take these questions and run with them in any given setting. In fact, you could even take a couple and try them at dinner tonight. Sit around with your children in school, and I'll give you some examples of that. The first question, and again, some of these fit the dinner table better than others, I'll point that out. The first question, and we've done this countless times, and these basic 5 questions are literally used all over the world in every kind of organizational setting. And what changes is you add more to this basic structure. But the first question is simply to ask people if you can, and one qualifier of all this, appreciative inquiry is ideally done in an interview context, realizing that people, I've done this down to junior high level, people can interview one another, just asking and listening. And so when you do it as an interview, you stop and you really listen to how a person answers each of these questions. And that's the power of really deepening engagement. It's one-to-one. It's not simply who decides to speak up in a small or large group. So that's a very powerful way of using this. You create a set of questions and then people go and interview each other. Well, the first question is simply about what first attracted you to our parish? What were your initial impressions? And this often gets people talking about some very powerful beginnings. And it's remarkable how much people have to say about that question. The second one is the most life-giving moment. When you recall a time when you felt most alive, most proud, most committed, most enthused about our parish, what made it such a fulfilling experience? What did people say or do that created that? You could wrap this conversation about any kind of parish experience, about a time of being welcomed, about a time of having a moment of spiritual discovery, about a time of discovering God in the parish, or you can just ask it in a more general way. This is the one when I mentioned dinner conversations. You could ask your kids, instead of, how was school today? And they say, okay, what'd you learn? Nothing. All that back and forth. You can ask a question, well, what was a best moment? When you did something today you were really enthused and excited about. I remember I asked this question. I have 4 young adult children. The youngest is 21. When the 21-year-old was 6 and the others were a little older, I asked them that and heard this incredible story about how the moms visited and they cried, and then because the kid sang a song, and he actually sang the song in front of his older siblings. Would have never heard that by just saying, how was school today? So you need to understand these questions are meant to go deeper into more powerful places. The next question is about things most valued. What do you value most about yourself, as not only yourself as a person, but as a Catholic, as a minister, as a priest, as a religious, about the nature of your involvement in the parish, and about what the parish or ministry has contributed to your life. Now, I'm using the words parish and ministry, but you could substitute any name in that, any setting. It could be our staff. It could be the name of a particular group. So we'll go on to the last 2 of these. The fourth question is about, as you think about the parish, ministry, whatever setting in general, what's the core image or factor that reflects what most gives life and represents its most essential life-giving quality? And then the 5th question is, if you could enhance or transform our parish in any way you wished, what 3 things would you do to enhance its life and vitality? And part of the art of this that's so important, you might say, well, why don't you just ask the 5th question by itself? Well, when people have touched these powerful, sacred things in their lives through the first 4 questions, the way they answer the 5th one is far more engaged in deeper positive meaning and spirit than if it was just asked by itself. So there's a flow to this, and basically, when you do the interviews, you just go right through the questions, all one way, and then someone else does it in reverse. But you can also use these, when I mentioned as clay, in everyday life. You can take 1 or 2 of these questions and just be conscious of trying to ask them. I'm going to give you just a couple more slides, and then we're going to get into a case study from Tony's parish. Remember, when I mentioned for topics, you could ask these questions around just about anything, but the art of the question is that you want to state the question affirmatively in a valuing of whatever the topic is. You want it to be compelling. You want to invite people's story. The power of this is the story behind the response, not the bullet. We're not looking for one-word answers. And if people give one-word answers, you just say, well, can you tell me more about it? Why was that important to you? Why do you feel that way? And you want the questions to be a little ambiguous, so people have to swim around. And again, you want to evoke deeper values and hope and capacity in people. And sometimes people will say, well, this is a little personal, and that's right. It's meant to be personal. We want to go deeply into what people care about. We're not looking for superficial fluff. Just let me give you a little example of that. This is one of my favorite stories. This actually happened about 12 years ago, but I've always liked it. It's from a very diverse parish in downtown Akron, a very urban, it's one of the major urban centers in our diocese. And I had used those 5 questions that you just saw with a group of 40 parish leaders. And when they answered them, I asked them to distill out, well, what are the images that are at the heart of what St. Bernard's means? And these are the 5 topics that they came up with, that they wanted to go and explore more deeply with the congregation. And they wound up doing a couple hundred interviews, taking questions around these 5 topics, wrapped within the other 5 I just introduced. And so let me just show you how this would play out. Community of many different people. So what we did is, this is how an AI question on a topic looks. We gave it a compelling title, which you see, a community of many different people. God invites all people here. And then we created a context. And the words in that context, we are blessed as a community of different people with unique gifts. All of those words are phrases that leaders mentioned in that first session. We just literally sifted it out of all their small group reports. And then you'll notice there's 2 questions on this topic. The first one goes more deeply into the past. Recall a time when you experienced an inspiring moment of welcoming or being welcomed. What did people say or do to create that moment? And then the second question goes into the future. Imagine us in 5 years where every person we encounter has an outstanding experience of being welcomed in our parish. What do you see people saying and doing to make that happen? And so you can take that A-B, look back, look forward, and wrap it around any kind of topic that you would like in any particular ministry or parish setting. So with that, these are some other practical applications we could speak to. But Tony, why don't you tell a little more of the story of what happened at St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, and then we can invite other kinds of questions for the remaining time.
Sure. From a kind of practical setup, you know, I mentioned earlier on that I was at a conference where Rick was speaking. I had never met Rick before, and he was talking on this topic, and it really kind of resonated with me, and it resonated in a way that I thought this would be really a great way for our parish to move into some strategic planning as we move forward about what are our kind of 3 major goals that we want to accomplish in the next couple of years. And so I invited Rick to come to the parish and to gather with our leaders. So we brought what we identify as our leadership together, which are people who sit on major councils of the parish, and just people that we identify as really strong leaders in the parish community. And we spent a day with Rick really outlining this process for us. And then we took hold of the process and really started to do the interviews with folks that Rick has just outlined. And we, you know, practiced and then started to go out into the wider community and have these one-on-one conversations about what really attracted people to the parish, what was life-giving to them, all of the kind of questions that Rick has just outlined for you. What was so revealing for us, what was actually kind of startling to us, was given our place in the world here in Plano, which is a very affluent area of Texas and pretty homogenous, the thing that the people valued the most was moments when our diversity had come together as one. Now, that was something we never would have dreamed of, never would have imagined that that was kind of the #1 thing that people here at St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Plano really valued. They lifted that up as one of their highlights. They lifted up hospitality and our outreach as kind of these charisms that they just really wanted us to look at. You know, one of the things that they really felt very deeply about. And so as a leadership team, we brought all of that information back, all of the things that we had learned in those interviews, and we started to dream about how we could enhance those things. What would it look like? And I just want to lift up one of the conclusions and one of the ways that we went through this process with one of the topics, and that was around the diversity theme. There were several others that we did this same process with. So we started to dream about what on earth could diversity look like here at St. Elizabeth's, which is predominantly white, affluent congregation. And we decided to design a Pentecost celebration that brought our diverse cultures together. Now, Now this is almost, I'd say 10 years ago now. And of course, in these last 10 years, Plano has gotten much more diverse. And the fascinating thing is we have attracted all of these minority communities that are moving into the area because they feel so welcomed here at St. Elizabeth's, because we celebrate their diversity. So we designed this Pentecost celebration that we do that brings together all of these minority communities, and we just celebrate them. So we went from the design to the actual doing, and it has become one of the highlights of our year. And when you look back on it, you say, my gosh, the Spirit was really breathing in that, because it guided us to a place to really be ready to open our doors to the more and more diverse communities that are moving into the Plano area. So the process was very, very life-giving and very affirming. And there are, I could give you 4 other examples of how we use the process to really lift up and to name in a very intentional and deliberate way what our values are, and then create and design and do a process that helped to lift that value and say, this is who we really are. Now, many of us, and St. Elizabeth's as well, we are now doing the Gallup survey. We've just finished it. I think we've logged in maybe close to 3,000 surveys. And there are, as you're listening about the Gallup surveys and you're listening to the kinds of questions that the Appreciative Inquiry process asks, you're hearing very similar themes there in the same questions Appreciative Inquiry asks and the same questions that the Gallup folks are asking on their survey. A survey is one thing, but when you're sitting down and you're having conversations face-to-face with people and they're sharing why their parish is so significant to them in its darkest moments, in their deepest, most hurtful moments, in their most joyous moments, the relationships that you create just out of those interviews with the Appreciative Inquiry process, you cannot replicate with the Gallup survey. That doesn't mean that the survey doesn't have its purpose and its place and yields great things, but the depth and the relationships that are built doing the Appreciative Inquiry interviews is really extraordinary.
Tony, what's just great, and that's just a great story, but that you also gave an example of true discovery, that things maybe looked one way, but when we actually asked the question, you discovered some pretty awesome things about what people really cared about. And that's so important, I think, for everyone listening to realize there is so much more for you to discover than you already know. And I can recall some parishes that, like in our diocese, would be seen as just outstanding places. And one of the key comments from the leaders was, we had no idea the parish meant this much to people. So there's so much, but it's like your people out there are all like gold mines, and it's just waiting to be mined, in asking the question. Stephanie, I'm wondering, I have a couple more slides that were more at the very end, which we can get into, but I wasn't sure if, going back to the previous slide, if there's any topic area people might want some example about, or if we should, time-wise, we should just go into some of the later parts. Just give me some guidance on that.
Sure. Why don't we just take a second, and if you have any questions at this point for either Rick or Tony, or you want to just comment on how you've been using this at your parish, go ahead and just in the chat give us a little bit. In fact, we may just continue on, but we'd love to see what you're doing out there. But if you do have a question right now, now's a good time to be asking Rick.
These are uses. I just put that slide just has applications in every one of those areas. There might be one people wondered about, or maybe they more just want to share something they did. That's fine either way.
I know that stewardship is a big concern in a lot of parishes, and using the Appreciative Inquiry process around just asking people in the parish, just naming it. You are so generous to this parish, and talk about that and asking questions about why people, give to the causes that they give to is so revealing, and it moves a parish forward to more and more generosity. So when I saw the philanthropic giving, I just wanted to comment about we have used the Appreciative Inquiry process so effectively with our Stewardship Council and with our parishioners around their call to give, and it has been pretty extraordinary in its results.
That's awesome.
Related to,
we do have a question from Tom. How do you go about training leaders in this process?
Well, part of it is, I mean, one of the things, you know, I've done a lot of that work, and there might be people near to wherever you are, but basically the way I've done this is we just have a day where people, this is kind of a very much of a crunch together to fit this time frame experience, but there's ways of not only introducing these concepts in more detail, but actually practicing it. And so typically I will always have people, like a group of leaders, do the 5 questions. I try to help them understand the constellation of thought, because I think the principles underneath this are very powerful, and the more you can create the constellation of thought, the more powerfully you use the tool. But essentially, you could just, you jump in and you give people the background. You start out with the 5 questions. You add some other topical questions, like I gave the one example from St. Bernard's, and then you help people to understand. And then we have tips for doing interviews, little things to do on setting them up and doing them. And you remind people that everyone can do an interview with someone else. It's harder for some people to just stop and listen, and they will always say that in the training. You know, I'm used to just talking and jumping in, and it's really hard to just sit and listen. You invite people to take notes of key phrases that are shared. When we do this on a large scale, we work with something like SurveyMonkey, so all the interviews being done can be entered directly by the interviewers, and so suddenly you can get a summary of what's being said. There's also other models for doing this where you actually do it in a summit. You can do a weekend summit where you maybe do the questions on Friday night, listen to the answers Saturday morning, get into the dream Saturday afternoon, go into the design Saturday evening. You know, people can commit to that. So this can be done in the whole process in 2 or 3 days. Or I've had other parishes that wanted to spend months just listening, so they could have interviews with as many people as possible. Because the interview itself, when I was working with a religious community on a national level, and they did about 500 interviews, and they had said, if we just did the interviews and nothing more, it would be worth it. So there's a lot of benefit all along the way with this. It's not something that only happens if you, you know, it's not you don't wait for the results just at the end. You're getting results all along the way.
And Rick, somebody is asking if they can get more information on your Pentecost celebration.
Or Tony's, yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
Tony.
sure.
Okay.
You know, and I think Rick mentioned that we'll have our email addresses up there on the last slide. If they just email that to me, I'll be happy to provide that information.
Okay, great. And you may notice that in the chat, Dawn was just mentioning that at St. Matthew in Charlotte, they've used this process for their pastoral plans. So if you want to follow up with Don Garbison on that, he's recommending it to everyone. So with that, Rick, would you like to go ahead and cover your last couple of slides? Sure.
Good. This is one on the whole spirit of what does it mean to live appreciatively? Like, how do you keep this alive in a parish or a family or one's life? And I think that the first dimension of this is you just ask, what is the appreciative inquiry question in this moment, in this conversation when I begin this meeting? There's a second point of constantly trying to be intentional about, I want to discover and sustain life. I want to foster a spirit of curiosity and inquiry. I want us to keep being innovative. Are we at our creative best in whatever we're doing? This next slide, living on the appreciative edge, simply recognizes that whatever has happened or is happening in any setting, in every act or utterance, there is always affirmative potential. Attend closely. There's always something to affirm and bring forward. And that little quote underneath that, I had a wonderful experience of knowing Father Phil Murnion for a number of years in his life, but at the very end of his life, before he died of cancer, I was visiting in New York, and I went to go see him a week before he died, and I'll just never forget this moment. And if any of you know Phil Murnion and his work with the National Pastoral Life Center, he was the founding director and leader and publisher of Church Magazine. He looked up, and it was a very special moment. I was there with my daughter, and he just looked up, and he says, Rick, it's all a gift. It's all a blessing. And I thought, that is the appreciative. And he was one of the most in-touch people I will ever know with the life of the church and the pulse of the church. And in these final moments of his life, that's how he saw everything. And that's certainly about living appreciatively. I think another image is say yes to the mess. That so often when we do new and different creative things, it's messy because we haven't done it before. And so it's really important to say yes to that. I know some people can do that easier than others. But so often, if we're going to do something that's not routine, it's not the way we've always done it, if it's going to be more creative, we have to be open to surprise and discovery along the way. And then related to that is embracing errors as a source of learning and discovery. So many of the greatest inventions, the most innovative organizations in the world discovered tremendous learning from errors. Rather than beating people up or getting all upset, they learned, what is this telling us? And how can we appreciate what's happening in this moment of error and become even better? And then as a last couple slides, this second last one, I think we began with the powerful leadership of John the 23rd, and this was one of his remarks that has been used in a number of settings. Pope John said, "Consult not your fears, but your hopes and your dreams. Think not about your frustrations, but about your unfulfilled potential. Concern yourself not with what you have tried and failed in, but what it is still possible for you to do." That sense of asking, what's still possible, no matter how much difficulty we may have encountered. And this is some contact information for Tony and I, mailing addresses, cell phones, emails, and we love this stuff. So if there's anything we can do to help you on any level, please feel free to call or contact us.
Well, I don't know if you can hear the applause on my end, but I cannot thank the two of you enough for this amazing session. And just so you all know, we did record this. This will be shortly up on the CSEC site. And again, I cannot thank you both, Rick and Tony, for sharing such a life-giving session. And this is it's so critical for all that we're doing. And I wanted to just mention, you know, I'm noticing that some people have posted in the chat that they are using this process. And again, I would love for as many of you that would be willing to share on the CSEC site what you're doing around this. I think this is a great place to continue this conversation. So again, thank you both, Rick and Tony. And I wanted to just let you all know that we are going to be having just a quick highlight of our next CSEC session is coming in November. I'm actually pretty proud of this one. This is my pastor, Father Ron Schmidt, who's going to be speaking about Vatican II and the empowerment of the laity. And in fact, he just led our parish through a 5-week process on the Vatican II documents with Michael Himes. And it was a great session, so I think it's something everyone will enjoy. And also for those of you that are on this session that are not already a CSEC member, we again just encourage you to go on there. And for those of you that are already members, we want to thank you. If you did complete the survey that we put up there, we were overwhelmed with the response, all the positive, talking about appreciative inquiry. We are very appreciative, and you have given us a lot of information that we are going to be sifting through and bringing back to you all of the wonderful comments that you shared with us. So we again thank you for all you do to make this community vibrant, and then obviously all that you do in your own faith communities. So with that, I just want to thank you all for being a part of this. Thank you again, Rick and Tony, and hopefully we'll see all of you back in November when we talk about Vatican II and empowering the laity. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steph.
Thank you.
Tony, are you still there?
I am.